All right, it is another fine Thursday evening here in Real.Monsters land. I am your host, S.K. Barrett. Joining me is the ever popular Wes Hobrick.
I guess it could be an appropriate greeting this time around to say Guten Tag, people. But we will get to that.
Right, absolutely true. We have been absent for 2 weeks because Wes and I have been trading off ailments, and
Yeah.
we finally managed to be well enough to, at the same time, to get back to this.
Yep, we can do it. Man.
Let's jump right in. Do we have some history today?
I don't today, actually. We
All
got
right.
actually quite a bit to cover on Fritzl. Um, as I was kind of making clear in our Facebook on there that we're switching a little bit with the format. We're not going to be going anywhere with the talking, but I've been condensing all of my notes into articles on these things, starting with Fritzl.
Oh
Um,
yeah. The by the way, the for anyone interested, the description of the show has the link to this very fine article.
Thank you. Yeah, it does. It is in there. And I was just going to grab it real quick and drop it into the chat if anybody needs it. I decided to go with the description over just doing that chat side though, because it's still clickable in the Facebook description, and it's not here. You have to copy and paste it. But yeah, this guy, he did have one charge of murder under him,
Hmm.
but other than that, he didn't kill anybody. And still, I think he's unequivocally one of the worst we're gonna talk about.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
You know,
it,
it's an interesting concept that, we have um, as a race, in fact, considered murder to be the ultimate crime.
mm-hmm,
Going back, you know, many tens of thousands of years before any kind of civilization, that was always, the worst thing you could do. And
mm-hmm.
yet, and yet there are things that one person can do to another person that might actually be worse.
Yeah, and I honestly think that one of them is incest. Um, that formed a big part of the research that I did for
Oh yeah.
this was especially Freud's totem and taboo, all about the incest taboo. Um, Pretty interesting. He takes a more anthropological look, but he's listed in one of the sources in the further reading of that I put at the end of the article on Medium there. But
Yeah, incest would be has always been considered, right up there for sure.
hmm Yeah, universally tabooed, basically. Meaning
Yes.
pretty much any culture says no to it and punishes harshly. Um, and a lot of that I think kind of gets back to the genetic issues that can come
Yes.
about from incest. Um,
Very many really cruel genetic afflictions that come from incest.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, more than a few there. Uh, but to get this story
Ask the
started,
European royal families how that works out.
oh, that's true. Man, which one of them wasn't it like Richard something number? I can't remember. I'm not that good at medieval history, of course, but
Mm.
the one who was like hunchbacked and had a bunch of issues from that.
Oh yeah, yeah. We'd have to ask Kelly all about that. But the Germans were no
Yeah.
slouches when it came to um, royal incest either.
Oh no.
Yeah.
No, I mean they definitely weren't, at least up until World War One, when
Right.
the Kaiser was booted. But to get things started off here, wanted to just set up a scene for anybody who is listening. This is 1984 in a small town in Austria, Amstetten. It's on the west German side of what's going on because we're still talking about like the Berlin Wall going up. So
Okay.
this is
All right. This
this
is
is
what what year are we talking about here?
1984.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So the wall is up still.
Yes. And while they aren't on the Soviet side of it, they are, pretty close to the Iron Curtain, as it were.
Hmm.
And just this scene there in Austria, there's a 17-year-old girl who opens her eyes in the pitch black around her, and her head's spinning, like the wheels on the bus that she had hopped to Vienna a few weeks earlier to
Okay.
try to get away from something that was terrifying her at her home. Um, it pain coursed through just all over, and she attempts to steady herself and gets off the cold concrete floor it's on. Meanwhile, the dirt on it is soiling her beautiful rust colored hair pretty badly. Um, there's no sight down there in the dark, humid cellar. And she blindly gets up and gropes around, and when she tries to do that, she's yanked back down with a tremendous force and just the sound of crinkling chains that you would expect in a dungeon. Attached to the dropping of water in another room, also making noise, and the
Okay.
scurry of rats and roaches, right?
Lovely.
The you, and then the cellar's lock slowly starts to turn, and she hears the sound of heavy steps creaking on the stairways down, then a flashlight beam in her face. And she still isn't totally sure what's going on, but little did she know that this ordeal of hers is going to last 24 years.
So it starts when she's 17 and goes on for 24 more years.
Yes.
Wow.
Now, I do think that she knew that it was going to be at the hands of her own father, later termed the monster of Amstetten, Austria, Josef Fritzl. And getting,
She did. You think she did suspect that?
I do, and we'll get to the reasons
Okay.
for that when we get further down in the history, but Fritzl has an interesting history. He's born in 1935 in Amstetten, Lower Austria, and his mother, Maria Fritzl, or after she meets his dad, Maria Fritzl, was the illegitimate child of a miller and Josef Fritzl's grandmother. This is it's kind
Okay.
of hard to explain this dynamic. Um, the grandmother was sterile, so what happens? The miller begins basically, liaisons with the maids that are in their home with the express purpose of having kids. And Maria was one of those.
But uh, his grandmother was sterile.
Yes. Yes, his
So
actual grandmother that raised Maria was sterile.
okay.
Um, like I said, it's a family dynamic at this
Oh,
juncture,
so
even
by
that doesn't make
grandmother you mean
sense.
the wife of the miller.
Yes, the
Okay.
wife of the miller, and the not the biological mother
Right.
of Maria or the biological grandmother of Josef Fritzl, but she still raised Maria, and she also had an effect in Fritzl's life too, as we'll see.
So the
Uh,
miller knocks up a servant girl
mm-hmm.
and has Fritzl's mom,
Yes,
but the miller and his wife keep the baby.
yes,
Okay. Got it.
yes.
Got it.
And then we get to 1934 when Fritzl's mother meets a drifter, also called Josef Fritzl Sr., basically.
Okay.
And then 1 year later, Josef Fritzl Jr. is born in 35. Um, and to set up a bit of context there, we're still talking about 3 years before what was called Anschluss. That was Hitler's nonviolent, I guess you could say. Oddly enough, it was his nonviolent invasion of Austria, an annexation of it.
Right.
So he didn't
I
fire a
mean,
shot to do that.
right. He just kind of overwhelmed him.
Well, yeah, and then you have the other fact that basically 90% of that country wanted to be part of the Third Reich when he went in 1938.
Oopsie, bad choice.
Yeah.
Not that they could have stopped him anyway.
No, they absolutely couldn't. But yeah, they wanted it overwhelmingly. Um, but yeah, after Joseph Jr., the Joseph who is our subject of what's going to be going on, is born. The family lives at 40 Ebestrasse in Amstetten. It's about 90 miles from where Hitler himself was born in Austria. Um, so fast forward to 1941.
Okay.
Joseph Sr. is fighting on the Eastern Front during the war.
Ooh, not a good assignment.
No, not at all. I mean, it was bloody and just horrible out there with the conditions that were going on.
For those of you who don't know, the Germans lost approximately 1 million soldiers on the Eastern Front.
Jesus.
Yeah,
Wow, I didn't know that number was that high.
yeah.
Um,
The Russians many more, but the Russians had many more.
well, but yeah, interestingly enough, in 1939, Maria actually booted Joseph Sr. from their home too. Not totally sure why. There's no like allegations of physical abuse by him or anything like that.
Well, he said
But
he was a drifter. He might not have been the best worker,
yeah, yeah, he might have just been,
which
a
is
louse
which
to her.
is probably worse than adultery in Germany.
Yeah, this is true. Let's not forget that culture, man. Wow. Um, but yeah, Joseph Jr. saw Hitler on March 7th of 1938, and after he was caught in the 2000s for what he did to Elisabeth, his daughter,
Yeah.
he went on to blame Hitler and Nazism and a whole other host of stuff for why Joe Jr., is a total piece of shit, basically.
Well, that seems kind of thin,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
put it
essentially.
lightly.
But yeah, Joe Jr. would only come back to Germany after being a POW in a Soviet gulag in 1948. And upon returning
Wow,
to,
that's pretty amazing because
yeah,
the number of German soldiers who were released from the Soviet gulags is like, I don't know, 10,000, something like that.
wow,
I mean, it's a minuscule amount.
yeah, and that's pretty small. And I guess it's not all that shocking considering Stalin's brutality,
Yeah,
especially.
yeah. I mean, he had no special reason to turn them loose. He had slave labor, and he
Yeah,
and he was very fond of working his prisoners to death.
this is true. Well, that, and I'm sure a lot of it was getting in there and punishing Germany for
Yes,
what they did.
yeah,
Yep. In fact,
absolutely.
that's not totally unlike after World War One too. But yeah, he came back in 1948, and when he did, he was essentially shunned by Maria and his son as being basically gutless and shameful. Um,
Really.
and
What
yeah,
I wonder what that was based on.
well,
He was a soldier. He was captured. He survived the fucking gulags. That's yeah.
one would think.
That's no small feat.
No, not at all. And one would think that they would get the benefit of the doubt. And Oddly enough, we're going to be talking about something very, very close to this next week when we talk about our topic then, too,
Okay.
because it happened essentially again. Um, and I'm not sure if it existed on Germany on this side, but for next week's topic, I know on the Russian side, it existed as a cultural dynamic that if you didn't kill yourself, you were basically branded a traitor if you got picked up.
Oh, very similar to the Japanese in that
Hmm.
sense.
Yeah, and I mean, like I
Being
said,
taken
I'm not
prisoner was
sure.
shameful.
Yeah,
I had never,
yeah,
I haven't heard of that being true on the German side, especially at the end of the war when entire armies would surrender at one time.
yeah. Maybe it wasn't true so much on that side, um,
I
but I
mean,
know,
but
like I
individual
said,
cases sure could have been true, you know.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. But yeah. I mean, even moving a little bit beyond that, yeah, Maria. I don't know if I explained this thoroughly. Maria was pretty off balance before the war
Oh,
started.
okay.
With many who knew her in Amstetten basically saying she wanted a child, but not the associated responsibilities of having a child.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
that's not how that works at all.
Oh, absolutely. Not at all. I'm not even a father, and no, not at all. I would not do that. But yeah, she would often beat, berate, and neglect Joe Jr. And in fact, her fiery temper is what got her arrested by Austrian puppet authorities of Berlin
Hmm.
after the Nazis came in, and she was sent to a concentration camp until
Oh,
1945 when she was liberated by the Russians, I would
s-
assume.
wow. Right, because they did not have mental hospitals in Germany at that time. They were very much in the job of emptying those out into concentration camps
Yes.
and mass graves.
If they saw you as a defective,
Yeah.
she's lucky she didn't get shot over that.
The only reason she would have survived, because if I remember from your article, it was late in the war when she was sent.
Yes.
So
Yep.
she must have been lucid enough to be a valuable worker, and that's the only thing that would have saved her life.
That's true. I didn't think about that part. It's most likely true though. Um, but for this huge stretch of time, so we're talking about literally months at a time here,
Yeah.
and Fritzl being 10 years old, he's left essentially alone
Oh.
throughout this in Amstetten.
Hmm.
Um, and the symbolism of this episode in his life is, I think, going to become very, very relevant when we get further down here. It was kind of amazing to me, in fact, just how symbolic it is to him. But somehow, shortly before she was released, he ended up in an orphanage too. But that wasn't for much time.
Okay.
Uh, and in there, he was told repeatedly that his mother was dead, which probably
Well,
wasn't
it's
an unreasonable assumption.
not a yeah, it's not much of a stretch. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
they probably had no way of knowing one way or another and might as well just, you know, yeah, that's a fair assessment assumption to make.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Because nobody was coming back from those camps ever. As
Oh
far as
no,
all people went and they never returned.
people had to know what was going on in Austria,
Well,
especially.
they had some ideas. There was probably a lot of whispers and suspicions and rumors and shit.
Hmm.
And
Oh yeah.
very likely none of those. One of the rare cases where the rumors probably were not anywhere near the scope and horror of the reality.
Mm.
Most of the times, rumors get blown out of way out of proportion, but not this time.
No, not at all. But yeah, fast forward to that time in 1945, she gets out and is reunited with her son, but her abuse of him didn't stop, and in fact, it was ramped up
Oh,
after
good.
her time in the camp. So, uh, Josef Fritzl ended up standing up to her when he was 15, and around that time as well, he also started to begin developing some pretty pronounced sexual deviancies or paraphilias, as we've talked about before with other killers.
Right.
Primarily, what he would do was voyeurism and wandering around just the different apartment buildings of Amstetten and listening for couples having sex.
Really.
Yeah, that's kind of different, I thought, because usually
Yeah,
they're going to go
and
for
it's
visual.
and it's really it's kind of almost you know uh, innocent, naive kind of a thing. I mean, it's non-intrusive, right? It's just
Hmm.
listening. It's not even peeking in windows yet.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's classified as a nuisance
Yeah, yeah.
sex crime. But yeah, interestingly enough, Fritzl would ultimately lock Maria in her own attic when which the windows were bricked up in, and she died in there. She was bedridden, and she died in there.
Sounds a lot
Uh,
like Hitchcock.
yeah, it really does. But Fritzl said in an interview with a forensic psychiatrist in Austria that his motivation for that was simple: revenge for
Yeah,
everything she'd done to him. So, but as they usually do in these cases, the nuisance type behaviors that he exhibited would
yeah,
escalate too.
yeah.
And
That's a common story.
yep, and he starts visiting prostitutes around, especially nearby Linz, Austria. And a lot of them report him being a very, very violent guy in there, a
Hmm.
violent John. So, and he also was actually picked up for exposing himself to young women. And another pivotal case in his criminal history, which we'll get to. But in 1951, he's 16, right?
Okay.
Or his bride, rather. Oh no, excuse me. I'm sorry. In 1951, he heads to Linz and he starts studying and presumably on the job learning to be an engineer because they were very, very in demand at
Sure.
that time after the war. And 5 years later, he would meet his wife, who would stick through him for most of this until the end. She was 17 years old at the time. Rosemary Byers is her name. And her dad actually worked at the firm as a technical assistant with Fritzl. So, but yeah, and he was very impressed by her. And what he particularly liked was what he just came straight out and said it: her obedience.
Ah.
Yeah, yeah,
See, that's a bad sign.
yeah. And it's another thing I think is very cultural in what
Yes.
was going on here. And it's a big reason, arguably, that he got away with what he was doing for 24 years. That, people in Amstetten in Austria, they just don't want to get involved if they see something,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Um, but by 1963, Joseph and Rosemary were married with 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son. And that year, he is sent by his employer um, to Ghana for a business trip. I think it was meeting with the supplier or something, but he
Ghana?
doesn't. Ghana, Africa.
Okay.
Yep. He doesn't return until 1965. Uh,
What?
Yeah, 2 years there. Not totally sure why, but yeah, in true form for what he was, a narcissist and a psychopath,
Yeah.
he actually divorced her in 2012 for, quote, failing to see me or him in prison.
Oh,
So, yeah, another thing that he bitched about with the media coverage after all this unfurled was being called a monster in it. And
oh.
seeing that, I was just like, fuck you, dude. I mean, it's just horrible. But um, yeah, he returns to Linz and Amstetten. He actually worked in Linz. And 1 year later, April 8th, 1966, his fourth child, Elisabeth, is born. Um, and they noted when he got back in 1965 that the stress of seeing his children growing and not being there, and then the stress of her birth, made him more of a autocrat around the house. And he was very, very much just a despot in how he ruled over his family.
Mm.
So I don't know how much of that is again cultural too, but it's
Yeah.
not inconsistent with his personality type.
It's almost a I don't know. I keep thinking about reactive attachment disorder.
Oh, that's true. I didn't think about that.
Um, and the thing about that is that everything that would normally make a person feel secure, uh,
Mm-hmm.
a person who's afflicted with RAD, it makes them very, very insecure.
Wow.
It's completely backwards.
Interesting. I gotta read on that. And I have
Yeah,
a
yeah.
copy of the DSM-5 here,
We
so
had
I
to
bet it's in there.
we had to deal with it. There was in my family there was a potential adoption with an undiagnosed RAD, and then once it was diagnosed, it's like, oh my God, no.
Wow.
It's yeah, it's so bad.
More symbolism from his early life during the war, maybe. I
Yeah,
would
yeah.
imagine something like that, yeah.
When he was
Set him
when he was
up.
10 and he's had to spend all that time alone, his dad goes away, his mom goes away, he's left all alone.
Mm-hmm.
Not just abandonment, but really, the inability to have lasting attachments, and plus the fact that his mom was Fruit Loops and
Mm-hmm.
treated him badly. On top of
Yep.
that,
Oh, yeah. It gave him just a pathological hatred of her in so many ways. But yeah, apparently when he was in Ghana, his predatory sexual habits were pretty much under control, as they quite
really.
often are,
That
I think,
seems,
with these
I would have guessed
types.
the opposite, that, being away from home and family would have, given him, uh, an excuse to really start exploring the dark corners of his personality.
I mean, that's very true. What I had in mind there was when we talked about Armin Mavis on the
Yeah,
last show,
yeah.
and he was in the army, and throughout that, his predatory sexual habits as well
Mm.
basically went away. Um,
Patty wants a clarification about him.
sure.
He divorced his wife, but stayed with her.
He divorced his wife in 2012.
Well,
Right?
but he was in prison though at the time, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yep, we'll be getting to that when we get a little bit deeper into this story. Yeah, he divorced her in 2012. But when Fritzl got back, his urges came back and they escalated for the first time. This is in roughly 1967. He follows the mother home from the grocery store, rapes her at knife point in her bed while her infant slept in a cot next to it.
Mm.
And you want to guess what his sentence was for it?
Nothing.
18 months in prison.
Wow.
Yeah. It's sad and weird, but you know what? It gets even sadder and weirder with this. Because Austria at the time had a law that said after 10 years, we totally expunge your records.
Okay.
Basically, no
Anybody?
matter what you did. Yeah.
Whoa.
Even sex offenders, they would do this.
Wow.
Yep.
10
And,
years?
yeah, after roughly 10 years, um, yeah, he gets that featherlight sentence and then that on top of it. Um, and it was this case, the Fritzl case, when they finally found Elisabeth, and the Natasha Kampusch case, which happened in 2008, which was another girl in an Austrian dungeon for about 8 years under a house, and they, being a sex slave for some guy, and they found her, and it was her case and Elizabeth's case that finally caused the Austrians to say, we got to get rid of this boneheaded law.
Yeah. Right,
Uh,
because the police go and do an investigation and they pull up the look at in their files and go, "Oh, nothing here.
oh
He
yeah,
must be a fine citizen."
yeah. I mean, absolutely, that's what they did. And granted, they didn't have the data so much on sex offenders back then, but they do now. We know that most of them are essentially incapable of rehabilitation,
Yeah,
especially when they are violent like
right.
this. So, yeah, they changed that in 2008. Um, but going back to where we were in this story, by the time it's 1972, the Fritzls had their seventh and their last child for a final tally of 3 girls and 4 boys. And during this time as well, his reputation as an engineer is gaining more clout, and he's also gaining much, much more independent wealth.
Okay.
So, so
So
what's he
he
do?
so he's a capable earner then. That's a real um, break from the pattern of what we've been seeing. But then again, he's
Yeah,
not a serial killer.
yeah. He's not a serial killer, but he does share some traits or habits with the likes of, say, BTK,
Right.
who what he would call that in the letters or in the letter that I had exchanged with him, he called it compartmentalization, where he could kill and then still be a pillar of the community, basically, or seen as a
Right.
pillar of the community. And Ian Brady, oddly enough, who we've also talked about, called this a house divided in an interview with the Shrink.
Ian
I think
Brady,
that,
one of the Moores murders, right?
yes,
Right.
Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. But yeah, Fritzl. So he decides to invest in a lot of property around Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, primarily guest houses, restaurants, and a 40-bedroom, 3-story hotel on a lake there.
Hmm.
Yeah. And he turned a profit on all this for quite a while. But when things started to go south with specifically the hotel, it caught fire.
Oops. Accidentally.
Yeah, the authorities could never prove it was insurance fraud with arson. But this hotel, or excuse me, the guest houses would be making news again in 2017 when the new owner of one of them found what he called a quote staircase to nowhere and various hidden rooms in the structure. And
Just in 2015, that recent?
2017,
Whoa,
yep,
just a couple of years ago. Wow.
yeah. And around that time, there was a murder in not well around the time that Fritzl would have had the place.
Yeah.
There was a murder of a 17-year-old named Martina P. That's all that the authorities would release as far as info.
Okay.
And as far as I can tell, there's nothing definitive linking Fritzl to this crime, but they just found it very interesting that these two things occurred together in time.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, Martina P., your body was found in 86, wrapped in plastic and dumped on the beach at nearby Lake Monse. Um, and the other interesting thing was she looked astonishingly like Elisabeth Friztl.
Oh.
Yeah, which I think we have a picture. Yeah, we had a picture there.
Yeah, it comes around pretty quick. Um,
That
Daddy
was
and
her at
daughter.
age 12.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the
We'll get some.
other one that I
Yeah.
think we had in there was the one of her with her red hair too,
Right.
which is an older picture of her. Um, but yeah, I honestly don't think you're going to hear much more about that case short of a deathbed confession from the man himself, from Joe himself.
And that's very unlikely, it sounds like.
Yeah, I would think so too, definitely.
Since he wasn't convicted of murder, right?
No. Like
So
I
why
said to
open that can
me,
of worms?
yeah. Yeah, and like I said to me, it seemed the only evidence that really tied it together was them happening the same time.
Yeah.
And as you know very well, and as others know, um, coordin- correlation does not necessarily equal causation.
Yeah. Coincidences actually do happen.
Yeah, yes, they do. But it was 6 years later, after 1972, so 1978, that
Yeah.
Fritzl starts a massive expansion to 40 Evestrasse, which remember has been in his family a very long time by now. Um, and his big part of that expansion was a gigantic, basically labyrinthine cellar under the outside rear of the house. And then on top of that, what he did was he built several flats that were to be rented out, for another cash flow, I would assume.
Right.
Um, but these flats, they had a very, very high turnover rate in them too, from
Really.
people coming. Yeah, which I'm not totally sure why. Maybe it was just the price about it, because it doesn't. 40 Evestrasse doesn't seem to me like it's a area that is prone to like high crime if you
Okay.
look at some of the videos around it. So, but yeah, very high turnover rate in them, which in turn also contributed to the unquestioning demeanor of the folks in there. If they would have heard anything from Elisabeth and her kids being shackled below them.
God, you know what? If you had no reason to suspect that shit was going on and you started hearing sounds
Yeah,
emanating from who knows where, I
wouldn't
mean,
be your first
you could have thought the place was haunted.
Mm, some people, yeah, definitely. I doubt sex slave would be many people's first thoughts,
Right.
even
Especially
now.
if you think you know the extent of the building and it's
Yeah.
not in any of those places.
Oh, absolutely. Um, but
We've got
yeah,
a number of pictures of this structure.
we do
I'll
down
pull
there
it.
in the cellar. And this is after Fritzl started stocking it, which we'll get to as well. But it was around the time of the construction that was happening that Fritzl began showing very sexually obsessive tendencies around his then 12-year-old daughter. He demanded to know where she was at all times. He often spied on her. And these behaviors would ultimately escalate to doing things like leaving porno mags under her pillow.
This is so backwards from most, uh, pedophile, incest perpetrators, where they start young and then tire of them as they get older.
It really is. It's a very interesting case from that view. But in 1981, so about 3 years later, Elisabeth starts a gastronomy and tourism course that is far enough out of town to take her away from the man that, as I said, I suspect she loathed most in the world at this time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, at the same time, she begun waiting tables to support herself. And this only got under Fritzl's skin and added fuel to the fire, as you can imagine.
Right.
It was also kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And he started escalating even more during this time when she was at home by doing things like exposing himself to her and leaving the porn where it was and just sexual abuse all around, even more. Um, and her friends at this time at school reported a very introverted girl who they knew it liked school better than her home life, but none of them really inquired as to why.
Uh,
So
right.
yeah, but in '83, Fritzl finished his cellar, and his use that he told people who were inquiring was to be storage and as a workshop down there. I think we have even a map of the cellar, don't we?
Yeah, it's coming up now.
Perfect. Um, and again, this isn't something that people would question being DIY and being done by an engineer. You know,
Yeah, except an underground workshop is kind of, well, I guess maybe for a German wouldn't be all that crazy.
well,
The Germans built a lot of underground workshops in World War II.
well, that's true. And even my late grandfather, who died of Alzheimer's disease in 2018,
Yeah.
his wood workshop was in his basement. So there's that.
Well, it's one thing to use a basement as a workshop. It's another thing to build a basement for a workshop.
Yeah, that's true. Because he just used one room in it for that,
Right.
with a lot of tools in it. But yeah, in '83 he finishes it, and it was January 28th of 1983 that Elisabeth ran away to Vienna. And still being technically a minor under the law, the police picked her up, and they held her until Fritzl made the drive there to get her.
Oh man.
Yeah, and on the drive back, he ominously says to her, "quote I'll never let you run away again."
Ay, ay, ay.
And fast forward. Oh,
But
go ahead.
see, here's the thing is, and this is true of so many of the situations that we've talked about is, from her perspective, one, she already knows she doesn't like this guy, but you just can't imagine where it's
This
all going
love
to go.
exactly. You can't imagine the brutality he had in mind.
Right.
But yeah, in May of '84, May of the next year, Elisabeth made the mistake of telling her father she was moving to Linz to live with her sister. And I would suspect that this really percolated in his
Mm-hmm.
mind, the way
Right.
that it did last time. And he wouldn't let it happen again. He couldn't let it happen again. Um, I suspect this also kind of relates back to that being left alone by a woman that he had his sights on, you know, just like with his mom. And in
Yeah.
fact, Fritzl later on, after he was caught, would admit to a psychiatrist, a forensic psychiatrist, that he often fantasized about sexual intercourse and domination with his mother.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is very, very Oedipal.
But what about the other sisters?
It, that's always a great question. Why do they pick the ones that they do
Yeah. And why
when
did
this
they
sort of thing goes on?
why did the it's almost like there was some triggering event, right?
Mm-hmm.
That started him obsessing over the youngest daughter. that wasn't evident or present when the older girls were growing up.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it very well definitely was. Or there was just some sort of feature that he saw in her that turned this obsession on in him, whatever it was.
I have a suspicion, and I'd like to come back to it.
Sure, absolutely. But yeah, in the article that we posted the link for,
Well, actually,
quite
we can I can bring it up now because it's been evident
sure.
already. She wanted to leave.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
That could have been enough. Just
The
her.
triggering event.
Well, yeah, but I mean, but she had that kind of a spirit, right? That independence, that
Oh, yeah.
wanting to get away. Maybe the other girls were just more outwardly, anyway, um, compliant,
Conforming. Yeah.
conforming. But this one was feistier, and I think that's
Yes.
evident, right?
Oh, yes. And that is actually going to get us back at the end of this whole thing to actually a somewhat good ending for this story, which
Yeah,
we'll get to.
we don't get to tell those kind of stories often.
No, we don't. But yeah, we put uh, some sources inside that article too that had to deal with it. But fast forwarding August 28, 1984, what Fritzl puts his plan into motion, calling Elisabeth to the garage with the seemingly innocuous request of helping him lift the door. And after this is done, he says to her, "Can you join me in my study for a private talk?" Not sure why she did, but not blaming the victim, but just not sure
No.
why she would have done that. So she does that, and when her back is turned,
Well,
he
I can totally understand that. If he's volatile, you know, the
don't
easiest
want to
thing,
push him.
yeah, the easiest thing is to comply just to make sure that, trying to keep him from blowing up, right?
This is true. Yeah, that's definitely true. But yeah, when she turns her back to him in his study, he has a ether soaked rag ready.
Oh,
Knocks her out, carries her to the cellar, handcuffing her and chaining her to a ring in the floor. Uh,
now this is in their main house, right?
yeah, well, just outside it.
Okay.
Just outside it in the back. And the only things that are down there when he does this in 1984 is just a bed, a toilet, and a TV. That's it. And the other thing with that, which we'll get back to, is the deficit of light, which I
Oh, yeah.
found particularly sadistic. But
That is awful.
after he trapped her, he made her write a letter to the family saying she ran away and joined what would later be labeled in the press as a satanic cult. And
Oh.
then he literally drove 100 miles away to post that letter.
See, I was wondering how he would explain it to the family.
Well, yeah, there's that. But it does get weirder how he explains this stuff. But during her time down there, want to take a guess at how many estimated times she was raped over 24 years?
Jesus. No, I don't.
3,000. 3,000 times
Man.
over 24 years in that cellar. And over that frequency of coitus happening, it's going to be basically impossible to avoid a pregnancy.
Uh-oh.
Right.
Right.
Her first one down there was a miscarriage. But now her first live birth was in 1988, a girl named Kirsten. From there on out, when the births occurred, Fritzl gave her a book on childbirth, a rag, a pair of scissors, and a few wet wipes, and basically said, "Do it yourself."
Holy Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. In that place devoid of any natural light.
Wow.
It just, it's horrible. But Elizabeth's second child, Stefan, is born in 1990.
So what happens to the babies?
Well, he lets them live.
But where?
Fritzl does
With
for the
her?
most in the basement, in the cellar
And nobody
with
hears
her.
these babies crying.
Nobody apparently did,
Wow.
or nobody acted upon it. But Stefan is born in 1990. He would go on to have excruciating back pain through the rest of his life because he was about 5'8" and had to always lean living down there.
Oh man.
Um,
Shallow,
let's
so not very tall ceilings.
yeah, not really at all. August 92, her third child Lisa is born, and Lisa has a heart defect. But Fritzl, he doesn't want to take the gamble of his upstairs family hearing a constantly crying baby because she's always in pain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, thus far, like we were saying, she hasn't noticed a thing.
Right.
So what's he do? He puts Lisa in a basket and literally leaves her on the doorstep of 40 Evestrasse.
Of his own house.
Yeah, with another phony note from Elisabeth.
Oh man.
And what gets me about this, if you look at videos again of 40 Evestrasse in that area of Amstetten,
Mm-hmm.
it's busy, it's bustling, it's a main thoroughfare through that town. I would think somebody would have had to have seen something.
Yeah. Well, there's seeing, and then there's knowing what you're seeing. I mean,
E-
honest
This
to
is
gosh,
true.
if you don't know to suspect something's amiss, you could see quite a bit and not know it.
Yeah.
I mean,
It,
God, people saw Bundy at Lake Sammamish Park, asking women to help him take his fucking sailboat, you know, I'll
mhm.
put it up on his car. He was asking people all over, and lots of people saw it, and they didn't know what they were seeing.
Very true. Yeah, I didn't think about the confusion with something like that. In which case it just gets buried. But Lisa apparently got emergency surgery, and by all accounts lived a somewhat normal life with her grandparents and her father,
Hmm.
grandpa father. I don't know what you would call that,
Yeah.
but meanwhile, while all this is going on, the cellar is getting even more cramped. So what's Fritzl do? He opens up more space down there, and he brings in things like a refrigerator, which he does his best to keep stocked, toys the children would like, and they even had a pet goldfish and a canary in that space that they could not leave.
All right. So here's the thing. That's a shitload of activity going on there. Stuff has to go in, stuff has to come out, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So how does a wife not notice any fucking thing?
That is a fantastic question. It's essentially unanswered, and it's also one that Elisabeth has been asking to this day. What did
Yeah, I
my
can
mother
imagine.
know? Um,
I mean,
but
there's deliberate ignorance, but this is ridiculous. I mean,
oh yeah, it's a whole
how
other
do you
level.
bring a fucking parakeet into the house and nobody knows it?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Uh, looking at the dynamic in Fritzl's
And the
head,
groceries and the garbage.
this is true. I mean, remember it was technically outside in the back under his flats. Maybe that was part of it. Where they weren't looking so much, but
But
yeah, I
according to this
completely
map,
agree.
there's one staircase into this basement area.
Yeah.
So
Oh yeah.
everything goes in and out from that one staircase. So
Yeah.
that's bullshit. Somebody had to see.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And not to mention that the ceilings in some of those spaces are even lower than what we were talking about with the 5/8 stuff on.
Wow.
I mean, basically a crawl space through certain parts of that cellar. But
And did he dig all this himself?
oh yeah, he built the thing, definitely.
Wow. That's a
But
lot of work for an old man.
yeah, it is. And it also begs the question of, did he know what he was going to do with his daughter when he started building that? Was
He,
it premeditated, in short?
yeah, good chance. And
I think so too.
that I would say that he was at least considering this plan when he built it. Maybe he didn't
I
know if he'd go through with it, but he was certainly thinking about it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I agree too. But the dynamic that was sort of going on with all that, like we were saying, he was sort of normalizing the space in his own warped,
Hmm.
twisted mind. And during this time, Elisabeth attempts her own normalcy for her kids. She gets them up at the same time every day. She cooks them breakfast in the tiny kitchen, and she even teaches them as best she can in that space.
Hmm.
Yeah. And all of this while her dad is still abusing and raping her, presumably in front of them. But
Jesus.
December 16th, 1994 sees the arrival of another child, Monica. And she's taken upstairs in the same fashion as the other one that we mentioned.
Wow.
So you got a second foundling at 40 Ebestrasse by this point. Um, and another thing that should be stressed here throughout all this with the two different foundlings, and there's actually going to be a couple more, Fritzl was getting financial assistance from the Austrian state to do what he was doing.
What?
Just like any other citizen, he was getting financial assistance from their government
For
to
the
do what he
babies?
was doing. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
To take care of his uh, I don't even bastard isn't even the right word for it. I don't even know what you call that. His his illegitimate in any way
Yeah.
children
Oh, yeah.
that he created through with his daughter, and they're paying for it.
Yeah. And the biggest reason there is that because of that fuckhead law that says that his
Oh yeah,
sex crime conviction was expunged, they never probed deeper
right.
when they were looking at the situation. They just assumed, oh, she's ran away to a cult and gave him money, basically. But in April of 96, Elisabeth gives birth again, this time to twins, Michael and Alexander. And Michael has horrible breathing problems. So what does Fritzl do? He allows the infant to die and throws the body in the furnace of 40 Ebestrasse.
Oh man.
Yeah. And Alexander is taken upstairs and he's made to be the third foundling on the steps of 40 Ebestrasse.
So now Elizabeth's by herself again.
Well, no, she still has the other kids down there.
Oh, okay.
Kirsten, Stefan, and the
Christ.
yeah, and it's cramped down there. Uh, and around this time, Fritzl starts going on a lot of business trips for weeks at a time,
Yeah.
and he would leave plenty of food, water, and vitamin supplements for what he was calling his downstairs family.
Jesus.
Yes. And in 2002, Elisabeth gives birth to her seventh and last child by her father, a boy named Felix. And what's interesting there, number 7 effectively makes his downstairs family a
Yeah.
mirror
Yep.
of his upstairs family. So, um, yeah, it's almost as if the upstairs family, who were properly integrated into their community, just weren't enough and only sort of stirred something in Fritzl. Much like how he stirred his mother's anger. He was, by most accounts, outside the family, a strict, angry man, like we were talking about. I would argue the unconscious way that he sought to remedy that was to have his second family downstairs and controlled exactly how he believes all women should be controlled.
Right.
But we finally get in this saga to a plan to end the hell that was
Oh,
happening. Fritzl was very fond of young Felix, right? So he wanted to get him upstairs and basically integrate both of the families if he can.
okay.
So to do that, he begins planning to release Elisabeth in 2008. And that date was chosen because that would be about the time that Felix would need to start grammar school. And he also believed at this time that the gaslighting that he did on Elisabeth throughout the 24 years was effective enough to where she wouldn't tell the cops. Like, he
Oh,
would tell her there were subterranean gas traps, electrified doors, and the like were his big things to her.
okay.
And as tends to happen with that, Murphy intervenes, right? Murphy's Law.
Right.
And before Fritzl could put his plan in motion, 19-year-old, she's 19 by now, Kirsten becomes deathly ill and almost comatose in that cellar. And all they had to treat her symptoms in there, profuse sweating, unusually white skin, of course, and all the symptoms of renal failure, all they had to treat it was aspirin.
That's not gonna cut it.
Yeah. So Elisabeth, she begs her father to get medical help for her daughter. And as she stood steadfast throughout that, she refused to go on herself. She basically said, I'm going to commit suicide if you don't do it.
Oh,
So what's Fritzl do? He takes Kirsten to the hospital. And the doctors, meanwhile, when they look at her, are very, very confounded by what's happening, her constellation of symptoms. And they actually turned
yeah.
out to be
Never having been in the sunlight ever.
yes, severe vitamin D deficiency, despite the lamps that Fritzl had also installed down there, and also the supplements that he gave them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's see. Kirsten had lost most of her teeth, and by that time had developed a habit of tearing her hair out in clumps and shredding her dresses and stuffing them down the toilet in the cellar.
Really?
Yeah, which I can't blame her at all in that
No.
environment. Um, but Fritzl, when he's in the hospital, he introduces himself as her grandfather. And the doctors, they keep asking him to get the mother in there, that we can take an even more thorough medical history and get a
Right.
handle on what's happening and save her. So the police, they search for her. And after about a week, they put out a televised appeal for Elisabeth to come home. And their plan when she got there was to charge her with severe neglect. But Elisabeth ends up seeing that appeal on her tiny TV in the cellar.
Uh-oh.
So when her yeah, so when her dad came back, she said to him, "You're going to take me in there, or I will kill myself now." And Fritzl, he acquiesces to it. So upon getting there, the police immediately arrest and begin interrogating Elisabeth. And it's only when they threaten to take the children that were still in the cellar from her that she finally tells them what Josef Fritzl had done to her for 24 years. And they immediately arrest him and free the other children
Wow.
in the cellar. So we get to that point. He initially pleads not guilty in an Austrian court to the charges including rape, false imprisonment, and deprivation of liberty. And Elisabeth and her children, meanwhile, they start, as you can imagine, intense therapy and
Yeah.
acclimation to the outside world.
Oh my
Uh,
God. Can you imagine what an ordeal that is?
oh yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
Jesus, just
amazing.
just saying what a street looks like for God's sakes.
Yeah, just seeing the moon.
Yeah.
And we'll get back to that actually, the moon in particular. But Elizabeth, she preps a taped deposition at her dad's trial, where no press and members of the public are allowed in. But as a final surprise,
Yeah.
she shows up in person and confronts him at the
Ooh.
trial. Yeah, yeah, pretty cool on her part there.
So
And when,
she's she's kind of feisty, isn't she?
yeah, she's
That's
a tough cookie, man.
that's that's awesome.
And even the devil himself couldn't break her. But when Fritzl saw Elisabeth, he supposedly changed his plea to guilty and wept uncontrollably. But I think that was just temporary. Um, but being in Austria, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with parole possible after 15 years, which is like the harshest sentence they could give him.
Hmm.
And getting into the afterthoughts, the postscript here,
Yeah.
he's still alive as of when I did this research and collected the notes. He's reportedly suffering from dementia, though, in the prison. Um,
That's
and
too bad.
Elizabeth, oh yeah, yeah, but Elizabeth and the children are still also undergoing the therapy. They reportedly suffer intense anxiety and panic attacks from a door closing or the turning of a lock.
Sure.
Um, yeah, and not to mention what we were talking about with Elizabeth's profound ambivalence toward her mother. They live in a location designated by Austrians as, quote, Village X, so they can live a normal life, supported by the Austrian state and with a good degree of privacy.
Oh,
Um,
so they have like their own little compound,
essentially,
kind of like.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, basically, they don't want to give away where she's at, and I can
Okay.
understand that.
Sure.
Um, but reportedly, she's also found love in the bodyguard who was hired to protect her.
Oh,
Yeah, say good for her on that, definitely.
absolutely.
Um, and yeah, interested with that moon thing we were talking about. That was one of the first things that happened when Felix got out of the cellar.
Yeah.
They were driving in the moonlight in Amstetten, and he just pressed his head to the window and wouldn't let up, because he hadn't seen it before.
Right.
He's only seen it on TV.
Wow.
And yeah, um, and Kirsten, she got out of her coma and it got out of the vitamin D deficiency. And the first words that she said upon waking up, a new life is starting for all of us. Let us be happy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jesus.
You know, quite a few psychologists who have looked at this said that they thought that Elizabeth wouldn't have survived if it wasn't for the kids who were with her down there.
Well, uh, I kind of disagree with that, in the
Yeah.
to the extent that she's a fighter.
Yeah, she definitely is.
Um,
There's no doubt whatsoever about that.
yeah, and a fighter. The kids, I'm sure, helped a lot. Um, but
Mhm.
I suspect that she would have remained a fighter even on her own.
Would have been, I think, much, much harder, though,
Oh,
you
sure,
know?
sure, sure.
But
Uh,
definitely, yeah. Um, yeah, she's amazing, in my opinion, to have gotten through that the way she did and still delivered that final fuck you to her father, who did that,
yeah,
all this to her.
absolutely. That's astonishing. This is one of the happiest ending stories we've ever done. We don't often get to cover something that ends so well. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah,
uh,
we don't. That unfortunately won't be the way next week
I'm not
with
sure
what
we'll
we're
get
looking
many
at.
more of them, but this one's good.
Yes.
Um, you know that fighting spirit. There's an opposite to post-traumatic stress, right?
Really? What's that called?
It's called post-traumatic growth.
Really?
Yeah, it's a real thing, and in fact,
Wow.
it's very, uh, because I was thinking about it one day when I was talking to my doc, and I said, so there's post-traumatic stress. Not everybody gets that, so there must be an opposite to that.
This
Yeah.
is true. It's definitely logical. I just never heard of it before.
It doesn't get much discussion because it's not much of a problem.
Yeah, this is true. This is
Um,
true.
but you know, the military is definitely interested in how people who experience post-traumatic growth, how they do that, and they
Oh
want to see if
yeah.
they can teach it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And apply some of the lessons to people with PTSD.
Yeah, before they go into
Mm-hmm.
those situations, absolutely. But
Wow.
and that comes to mind because this sounds like, very much like a case where she very likely has post-traumatic growth versus PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
um, because she, that ability to go into that courtroom and face him down.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. But yeah, I wish we had more of those too. I really do.
Yeah.
Um, I will do my best to look for them for our
Yeah,
listeners.
it's a wonderful change of pace.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, if we can get if we can get more of those, yay. But sadly, those sick fuckers are just you know, too effective in what they do most of the time.
Yeah. Unfortunately. But yeah, rotten hell, Josef Fritzl.
Yeah, this guy was brutal
Yeah.
in in a non-murderous way for the most
Yep.
part. It's surprising he didn't get any uh, you know, manslaughter type charges for the kids that died.
Yeah. Yeah, you would think so, definitely. He's one of them who's further up in Dr. Stone, Dr. Michael Stone's scale of evil that we often talk about.
Mm-hmm.
The forensic shrink.
Yeah.
I want to say Fritzl was something like 20 out of 22 that he had
Okay.
in there, which is inordinately high. To give a little bit of perspective there, Charles Manson is only like a 17 on it.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah, yep. He's another one of the sources I put in the Medium write up I did
Yeah, good
before
job
the
on that
show.
one, by the way.
Thank
Uh,
you.
eh, for those of you who are listening now and in the future, check the link in the description for the article that Wes wrote up related to the subject matter.
Absolutely. Essentially, show notes condensed into something that is different, I guess you could say. Something that's readable.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, definitely. And I'm going to do my best to get one of those out every week before our show.
that's
So,
amazing. Awesome job.
thank you.
All right. Another one bites the dust.
Yeah?
I'm not playing that song. We do not have rights to play that song.
Nope.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.